We are 1 week from Super Bowl Sunday, the Seattle Seahawks and the New England Patriots, and of course starting at quarterback for the Seattle Seahawks is former Jets third overall pick in 2018, Sam Darnold. So I say that as we bring on our guest, ESPN Jets reporter Rich Cimini, because Rich, I was reading your story this morning. You had former Jets GM Mike Maccagnan on the record talking about Sam Darnold. So I want to start there. Give us the breakdown in this story that's up on ESPN.com about your conversation with the guy who drafted Darnold.
Good morning, guys. Thanks for having me. Yeah, Jake. So it only took me 7 years to get this interview, but I finally pinned down Mike Maccagnan. And hey, if you can't talk now, when your former draft pick goes to the Super Bowl, when can you talk? So he was very gracious with his time this week, and we talked a lot about Sam and retracing the decision into drafting him and what it was like for him watching it last Sunday, him celebrate the championship, the NFC championship. And the thing that struck me, guys, during the interview, actually pretty early in the interview, Mike got choked up talking about Sam, just some of his memories of the draft and some of his early days with the Jets. You know, he said, geez, I didn't think I would get choked up talking about him, but here we are. And so obviously he feels good anytime a GM makes a draft pick that turns out like that. And of course, it was a rough road for Sam. And when I asked Mike, I go, do you think the Jets should have traded him? And now, you know, just to be clear, Mike was gone by then. That was Joe Douglas. And he goes, yeah. He goes, it really makes me sad that he wasn't able to finish it out with one team. He goes, I wasn't there. I wasn't privy to what was going on in the building. But from his perspective, he wishes he could have stayed with the Jets. And so, yeah, it made for a very interesting story 1 week before the Super Bowl.
You know, what's interesting is I'll just shed some light on what you just said. It's kind of hard to explain, guys, but, like, I'm not surprised to hear Mike Maccagnan's reaction because it's not the same, obviously, but I used to joke, you know, I'm fortunate to have, you know, 2 kids at home and 90 in the office. And, like, to be candid, like, Mark Sanchez just went through some really difficult times, which are well documented. Like, it hurts. Like, and, you know, I'm not going to share private conversations I've had with him, but I would just say, like, you have an attachment with players you draft. You just do, because you spend so much time with them and you do so much research. And then, you know, in our case, we had, you know, really great success and a lot of good times. So I'm not surprised to hear that. I guess my question would be is, like, does he feel, like, vindicated or validated by the success that Sam Darnold's had?
I asked him that question, Mike, and, you know, he said, no, there's no vindication. He goes, of course, when you see something and you envision something and it turns out to be the way you envisioned it, of course it makes you feel good. And he goes, but I think every scout feels that way. So he didn't say vindication, but of course I'm sure deep down inside him there's an overwhelming sense of satisfaction to see a player he drafted, a player who obviously struggled. I mean, let's not minimize, you know, Sam struggled with the Jets. His last year with the Jets was not good. And he went on to, it was a very circuitous journey. I mean, it was a rough road for Sam Darnold. You know, he was benched in Carolina. He was on the bench in San Francisco and finally hit it with Minnesota, but they gave up on him too, you know. And I also talked to Jamal Adams and Robbie Chosen, the former Robbie Anderson, for that story, and Kelvin Beachum, and they all felt the same way. You know, they felt great for Sam and just wished, you know, it had been able to work out with the Jets.
Rich Cimini is our guest, ESPN Jets reporter, host of the Flight Deck podcast. Again, if you want to read the full story that Rich is referring to, check it out on ESPN.com. Rich, as far as the present-day Jets are concerned, I was down in Mobile with Mike, and in back-to-back days, the Jets fired an offensive coordinator and hired a defensive coordinator they only spoke with over Zoom about 18 hours prior. What were your reactions to the Engstrand firing and, of course, then Brian Duker being hired the next day as the defensive coordinator?
Well, both were surprises. I mean, because every indication we were getting was that Engstrand was going to remain on the staff and maybe not in a play-calling role, but in another role, and then all of a sudden he's out. And just as a postscript to that, last night he ended up landing a job with the Falcons as their passing game coordinator. I think it was kind of a raw deal. I mean, he was saddled with arguably the worst quarterback situation in the league, and it was, you know, a ton of stuff that fans know I don't have to go into. So he's a promising coach. I just felt that Aaron Glenn is probably feeling a lot of heat right now and felt like he had to do something. As for the defensive coordinator search, well, that was a surprise too, because, they interviewed the 8 candidates, and next thing you know, they hire the 9th guy, Brian Duker, who was a relative unknown. And so I don't believe he will be calling plays. I believe Aaron Glenn will be calling plays. I think everyone expected that to be Wink Martindale's job. I think Wink Martindale thought it was going to be his job, but when he showed up for that second interview a week ago, it was like 8 days ago, before the snowstorm in New York, met with Aaron Glenn at the facility, and all of a sudden the rules had changed a little bit. Not the rules, but the landscape had changed a little bit, and Glenn told Wink that he had decided to call the plays himself. And I think that happened right after a meeting in West Palm Beach at Woody Johnson's home, their postseason organizational meetings, and so which they have every year after the season. And so after that, it seemed like the landscape changed a bit. So I can leave it up to you guys to connect the dots on what may have happened there. But he ends up with Brian Duker. But in the end, I think it's a good move, actually, because I think Aaron Glenn now controls his own fate. He can call his plays. There will be no disconnect with the defensive coordinator. He can run his own scheme from the Lions. He doesn't have to worry about another guy doing what he wants. So in the end, I think they ended up in the right place. I question how they got there.
Yep. No, that makes sense. And, I said to Jake earlier, what's so hard about what's going on right now is, the macro in the NFL. It's just staggering to see, Sean McDermott get fired late in the process, Minnesota firing their GM. I saw Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah down at the Senior Bowl scouting. So, this is like a hiring cycle unlike any others. And, again, I know we're always in a rush to make a judgment here, but, we got to just see how it plays out and see who they replace Tanner Engstrom with and how, the whole staff gets fleshed out. I guess, when do you think we'll know, when does this all, come together, Rich?
Well, they're going to interview their 3 finalists for the OC job early this week, Darrell Bevel, Frank Reich, and who am I missing? Who's the third guy? Greg Roman, who just got fired from the Chargers. And so I think there'll be a decision on that early in the week. The one thing I would add to your point about the overall coaching cycle, Mike, the one thing about this, though, that I think drives Jet fans nuts is that it just took so long. And I think, why, if you're going to move on from 8 assistant coaches, why not do it right after the season ended so you could get a head start on the search? Why wait a couple of weeks before firing your OC? It just makes Aaron Glenn look indecisive. And so it just creates a perception of dysfunction in the organization. Now, whether things changed after that meeting with Woody Johnson down in West Palm, I don't know. I think probably, but I think that's what drives Jet fans a little batty right now is it's like, why wait? So now the Jets are scrambling. It's a fairly latter stage of the coaching cycle right now to try to fill these jobs.
I think you're right, Rich. And just to kind of add to that, I just look at Aaron Glenn, who a year ago when he was hired, part of the reason he was hired, we were told by everyone, he's going to hire a great staff. Coaches are going to want to work for him. And if you go back through recent NFL history, the only example you could find of a coach changing both coordinators after year one is Hugh Jackson, who went 1-15 and then 0-16 in his first 2 years. So it just feels like Glenn now calling the defense, okay, great, maybe that makes some sense, but he was supposed to be the CEO coach and coach the whole team. And now, again, just like a lot of this past season, it just feels like the Jets' plans continue to change, and there's no clear direction what they want to do.
Yeah, this is just more me theorizing and maybe sort of informed speculation. But I think at the end of the year, I just from talking to Aaron Glenn at the final press conference, I think he preferred to be the CEO type coach. He said he would go through the process for a DC and then ultimately make that decision. I think if he had his druthers, he'd probably want to stay on in the CEO type role. But, the past led him to calling the plays on his own. And it is weird. I mean, I think it's it's not the number of coaches. I mean, we all speculated, and I'm sure you did too, Jake, that those guys who got dismissed, those 7 or 8 coaches, I think we all speculated that they would probably be fired. It's just that it took so long, and that creates an air. Like I said, there's some indecision involved, and I think there's a money component to this as well. I think maybe Woody Johnson said to Aaron Glenn, look, I'm paying you $12 million a year. You're a pretty good defensive coordinator. Why don't you do it yourself? I'm already paying a DC who's no longer here, Steve Wilkes. Why don't you take the money and go out and get yourself a really good offensive coordinator like a Frank Reich or a Darrell Bevell and spend the money that way? And I think that's ultimately how it's going to come out.
Anything else that Jet fans should be keeping an eye on this week, Rich?
No, I think it's all eyes on the OC, and it's an interesting group of OCs. They're all experienced, which I think is really important. Now, you don't want to hire another first-timer. You want an experienced guy. Greg Roman, I think the attraction there is that he's a guy who's known for a good running game. We know what Aaron Glenn wants to do on offense. He wants to run the ball. However, the red flag there is that, Greg Roman's longtime buddy and close friend and colleague, Jim Harbaugh, just fired him. So what does that say? Bevel's been around a long time. Interesting now that it's a Seattle-New England Super Bowl. He was the offensive coordinator who didn't give the ball to Marshawn Lynch at the goal line, which led to perhaps the most infamous interception in Super Bowl history. And so Frank Reich, I think he's got a connection to Aaron Glenn. They were teammates on the 96 Jets, of course, an infamous year and 1-15. But from what I understand, I think they've maintained a relationship over the years. I think there's a lot of mutual respect between those guys. And so I think Frank Reich, if I had to put money on it right now, I'd say he probably ends up as the winner, the OC.
Rich Cimini is our guest, ESPN Jets reporter. Going forward, let's say it is Reich. Obviously, he's a former quarterback. He's got experience with quarterbacks, so there's some logic there. But you look at Frank Reich's recent track record. He was out of the league in 24. He was 4-8 at Stanford this year, filling in when Andrew Luck gave him a call and said he needed someone. It didn't end well in Carolina. He didn't make it through year one. He got fired at the end of his Colts tenure in the middle of the season. Is any other team lining up to hire Frank Reich? It just feels like that might be the best the Jets could do. But again, if Frank Reich, mid-60s, been out of football, away from the NFL, that's not exactly the most inspiring hire, I think, for Jet fans.
I don't know of any other team, NFL teams, that are interested in him. I do believe there are some college opportunities that have been presented to him. He is technically still working for Stanford as a senior advisor, though he's doing that at home in North Carolina. I would say this about Reich. Obviously, Carolina was a disaster. He didn't make it through the first year. He had Bryce Young. That was a dysfunctional situation. You just had an owner who really forced that draft pick. I think Frank Reich wanted C.J. Stroud. Tepper wanted Bryce Young, so they picked Bryce Young. It didn't work out. Just a really, really messy situation. I really wouldn't hold that against him too much. I thought he did a good job with the Colts. They were a top 10 scoring offense 3 times. He had a different quarterback each year in Indianapolis. So I think that should prepare him for the Jets, another team known for quarterback instability. He's gone through that, and to make the playoffs with guys like Jacoby Brissett, and he did have luck the first year, then Brissett, then Carson Wentz, then Matt Ryan. And so I do think if they end up on Reich, I think the guy to watch, in terms of possible quarterback options for the Jets would be Jacoby Brissett, who is now under contract to the Cardinals. I think that would be something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I was thinking about the dot connecting world. I guess obviously it depends on, what happens. If Mike LaFleur gets the job in Arizona, does he want to take Jimmy Garoppolo from the Rams? Does that make Brissett available with Frank? It's again, it's the fun part for what we do now. But we'll see how it unfolds. So it sounds like based on what you're saying, Rich, it sounds like you think it's almost Frank Reich's job to lose.
Yeah, but I always we learned with the Dukers situation, you never know until it's done, right? So, who knew there'd be a 9th candidate, an 11th hour candidate? So, I know the Jets were interested in Reich for a while here, for a few weeks. There have been multiple conversations. And so I do think it's probably going that way. But again, I thought Wink Martindale was the guy too. And then, the tables got turned. And so that changed as well. So you always have to add that that qualifier on the end. Bevell he's a former quarterback himself, not on the professional level, but in college. And he's been around a lot of different coordinator situations. So I don't think he'd be a bad choice either. I think it's very important that they get a guy who sees the offense through the quarterback's eyes. I think the Jets were a little a little antiquated last year, just in their belief that they want to run the ball so much. And I get it. He wanted to set a mentality. He wanted to create a brand, to use Aaron Glenn's word. But I think you want to, the way the NFL is nowadays, you have to be able to throw the ball downfield. Explosive plays are a critical stat in today's NFL. The best teams always create a lot of explosive plays. And so I'd want a guy who has that quarterback expertise like a Reich or a Bevel. And you would hope that Aaron Glenn would see it that way as well. And I think we'll find out in 24 to 48 hours.
Rich, we appreciate you joining us as always. Enjoy a day without football, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right, guys. Always a pleasure. Have a good one. See you, Mike.